Well, thanks for attending. I think everybody knows who I am. But for those that don't, I'm Dominic Doig, the second one of the two, and my co-director, John Rossiter. So we're both directors of Solomon's Europe. I know a lot of you know Solomon's Europe, just a bit of background to us. Our business employs 45 QSs, cost engineers, project control staff, and we work across the country on various oil and gas type projects, wind farms, renewable energy projects, pharmaceutical projects. So we're very much into process engineering, and that's what we do. I'm going to start off and do the first 20 minutes or so of the presentation, and then pass over to John. John's going to focus, excuse me, on more of the procedural aspects of the NEC in terms of change management, the process of the early warnings, the compensation events, the way that the program is used to manage change, and I'll do my little slot at the beginning more about some of the key issues that I see on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so for us as cost engineers and project control staff, QSs, whatever phrase you might want to call yourself, one of the key issues that I see out there in the industry is the difficulty with administering change under the NEC. The difficulty in administering NEC per se is a lack of fundamental understanding of the contract terms. So how many people here use the NEC on a regular basis? Two? Yeah? Half? I reckon. Probably some more in there without putting the hands up. I might ask questions. Very often you'll see people are administering the NEC unaware of the terms of the contract. And the contract itself, it's a very simple document. It's a framework document. It's a set of procedures in effect. Effectively like a QA manual. Now, my belief is that we should have a better grasp of what this document says, because that's our job. If we're administering change, managing change on behalf of our employer or our contracting organisation, we need to be aware of this. You know, if you were working as an HR administrator in a company, you know, you'd be expected to know the procedure for statutory sick pay. You'd be expected to know the procedure for maternity rights. You'd be expected to know the procedure for disciplinary or grievance. And your employer would be expected to go to you, and you should be able to give them a detailed précis of what the procedure is all about. But time and time again we find that people in the commercial world can't give a detailed understanding, information about the contract they're working under. So I think that needs to improve. We need to all work hard in that regard. It's the same with the change process. The change process under NEC is a simple procedure if operated correctly. But not many people understand that the change process under NEC is a four-stage procedure. You've got the notification, the quotation, the assessment and the implementation, the various timescales in there. So I mean, for example, how many people here know how long a contractor has to notify of a compensation event? Does anybody know? 8 weeks? Brilliant. And that young gentleman is actually joining our business a week on Monday. Fantastic, we've made the right decision. Well done, Thomas. I was dreading you were going to open your mouth then and say the wrong thing. Brilliant.
Did you ask the question of the interview?
I don't know, I didn't ask him the question at the interview. No, I didn't ask that, but I did ask him some other NEC questions. Well done, Tom. Brilliant. Right, I've lost my track now because that was such a good answer. So yeah, so people aren't aware of the procedures under the NEC, and they need to be. Program requirements. The program requirements are there to assist and support us contract and cost engineers in terms of managing the commercial processes. So for example, you know, a lot of people don't understand or aren't aware of how often is the program to be updated. And does anybody know that? Well, it depends. I mean, it depends. It depends what's agreed in the contract data. So you might set out in the contract data to update the program every fortnight. It could be monthly. It could be quarterly. But also, the project manager can ask the contractor to update the program at any time. And then the contractor has what's known as the period for reply to provide that program, so that's very often 2 weeks. The contractor can update that program whenever he chooses to do so, so he might want to update it every week. So there's 3 parts to that, on the face of it, straightforward answer of updating a program on a monthly basis. So we should be aware of that. That's the point I'm trying to make. And I think a lot of cost engineers and project managers in the industry aren't aware of these fundamental procedures. So if we're going to be effective change managers, which is what all this presentation is about, we've got to go back and make sure we understand this like we would if we were an HR advisor. Another fundamental point that I find time and time again with cost engineers, QSs, is how on earth can you administer change, how can you value change, how can you price it if you don't understand the scope of the project? You don't understand where to find the scope of the project, for a start, in many instances. I was at a meeting with a guy called John Lever a couple of weeks ago. John Lever's a senior guy in the RICS. He's the guy that assesses the assessors that then assess candidates to become chartered surveyors. And he was telling me a little tale of a lad, we'll call him Simon, because he was called Simon. That's what I call him, Simon. A lad called Simon was having an assessment, and he fell foul of this lack of understanding of the scope of his project. He understood the NEC, he understood a lot of the other competences that he was being assessed against, but in terms of the scope of the project, he was working on an HV substation project, and in his assessment to become a chartered surveyor, he was asked questions like, so this HV substation, what are the walls constructed of? Cladding, what type of cladding, what's the specification of the cladding? Couldn't answer. How is the cladding fixed to the structural steelwork? I don't know. Is it bolted? Is it welded? If it's going to be bolted, how do you start water ingress when you're bolting through the cladding onto the steel? Couldn't answer these questions. So that was enough for the assessors to say at final assessment stage, he didn't feel that this candidate was worthy of becoming a chartered guy because he was expected to know the fundamental concepts of the construction of his project. And again, a lot of us as cost engineers, we might sit behind our laptops doing monthly earned value analysis, cost reports, whatever the scope of our projects are, but how many of us understand the scope of the job well enough to be able to accurately manage change under the project? Probably a skills gap there for other people. And then also we need to get better at understanding what constitutes change. So if we're going to be change managers as cost engineers, what constitutes a change? Now, does anybody know what constitutes a change? And give me an example of a change under the NEC. So anyway, I produced this little sheet. This gives you the 19 reasons for a compensation event. So you can, this presentation, I'm assuming, will be on the internet. Yep. Very proud of that. Can't wait to see this thing. Hopefully it all works out. So it's worth learning, as a QS working on NEC, you should learn these. Try and learn as many of these as you can, because when you're in a meeting and you sat there with the contractor or the employer as the PM's representative, there needs to be triggers going on in your head. Hang on a minute, isn't that relating to a PM instructing us to stop or start work? That's one of the 19 CEs. Hang on a minute, is that an employer's risk? One of the 19 CEs. So if you don't know these, you haven't got a grasp of these in your head, how on earth can you do your job when you're actually there day to day working on a project? So just quickly running through them. So what are they? Well, we'll go on the top line first. So the employer doesn't allow access. Now, that is, the actual phrase says, doesn't allow access in the later of the access date that's on the current accepted program and the access date in the contract. So it has to be the later of the two. Because you might have an access date in the contract of the 1st of January, but the contractor's program might say he requires access on the 1st of February. So it's only once the 1st of February is expired and you haven't given access does it constitute a compensation event.
Can that be access to the physical site and also access to information?
It can be, yeah, but this specific one is access to the site. Access to information is, when you talk about the 4th one along, doesn't provide something shown on the accepted program. Yeah. So if you're working for the contractor and you want Sellafield to provide maybe a free issue pump, or you want Sellafield to provide some drawing information, then you need to put that on your program that you submit for acceptance, so that when the employer doesn't provide that on the date you've said, then it becomes a compensation event. And that's where a lot of contractors fall foul, because they don't put on the programme dates when they require actions by the employer to happen. So then they cry, don't they?
Yeah.
I've not had the pumps. We needed them 5th of June. Well, it's not on the accepted programme. Tough. So employer does not work the times on the accepted programme. So you need to put on your programme when you want the employer to do something. So we want the employer or others, managed by the employer, to put the civil foundations in for that pump in the first week of January, etc., etc. Physical conditions we've talked about. Weather, obviously we understand weather. And then there's the 1 in 10 rule. We won't go into the specifics, but it's basically exceptional weather that occurs less frequently than once in every 10 years would constitute a compensation event. Not just the fact that it's rained today and that stopped the guys digging a hole. Moving along, the project manager notifies a correction to a CE assumption. So when the project manager asks the contractor to provide a quote for a CE, he may well say, this is my set of assumptions. So he might say, I want you to price for painting this room here, and I want you to assume that you do it out of hours when the hotel's shut. So you can do it between midnight and 6 o'clock in the morning. So if that assumption then turns out to be incorrect, he does it some other time, then he would correct his CE assumption, and whatever the change would be, the additional cost would be another CE. Yeah, an employer's breach of contract, depends what the breach is. Employer doesn't provide facilities or materials for tests and inspection as stated in the works information, so it may be that the employer said, I'll provide the laboratory facility for you, and then doesn't. Makes sense. Project manager certifies takeover before completion and the completion date, so he may well want to do that. So if he says, I want takeover a week before, contractually entitled to do so, then it makes sense. You've been entitled to a CE. So moving down to the bottom, we talked about changes to the works information. That's why it's so important that works information documents are drafted accurately. Okay, we need to move on briskly now. So we've got project manager instructs to start or stop work. That makes sense, doesn't it? You'd expect compensation for that. The project manager doesn't reply to a CE in the period for the reply. Yeah. Project manager changes the previous communication. So I said one thing one day and now I'm saying the other. So fair enough. Project manager withholds acceptance for a reason not in the contract. So yeah, the contract says these are the reasons that you can and can't do something. So you can't just choose not to accept something for some other reason. Yes, that makes sense. Project manager's instruction for dealing with a historic object, okay, doesn't happen very often. Prevention, John talked about. AM instructs a search for defects and none are found. Again, you expect as a contractor to be compensated. Or supervisors' tests cause delay. If the supervisor's doing some tests and spends 2 weeks doing it and he should have spent 1 day, then there's an issue there, isn't there? The cost engineers, we get issues with being able to accurately estimate the cost of change. Under NEC, that should be far simpler because the NEC includes a schedule of cost components. So is anybody aware of the schedule of cost components? Yeah, it's effectively a prescribed list of what you can recover as a component of cost. So it should make life easier. We're also assisted with the NEC and us as cost engineers assessing change because we can ask the contractor to provide a quotation, and then the contractor's got 3 weeks effectively to provide that quotation. So as we're working along one side doing a little estimate for our employer, we've got the contractor working, producing his estimate and his 3-week timescales. At the end of it, they come together. Hopefully there's some alignment there. So we should be able to use the NEC more than we probably do in asking the contractor to provide quotations for us. Mini tenders, as people often refer to them being called. The programme and the delay aspects, well, that's often an issue for us as cost engineers, isn't it? Very good at assessing the cost of the specific direct costs of a change. So changing that door from that type of door to another type of door, we're very good at doing that, £1,000. But what we're not very good at is what's the prolongation, the indirect costs associated with that, and we all worry about that, and at the end of the day we get this claim for 16 weeks extension of time. That's the traditional way. But John will come on to program a little bit. Obviously, a compensation amount deals with it as a package of time and cost. So it should be all wrapped up in one event, one quotation. So that's going to help us as a cost engineer. And it's the same sort of thing really. With NEC, it helps us get away from this issue of having to wait for the claim at the end of the project in the traditional way, because there are sanctions for not raising early warnings by the contractor and sanctions for not notifying the employer in terms of the timescales that are set out in the contract, so that's helping us in that regard. So for me, the projects that work well are when we're working with our counterpart, with the employer, very closely. Sometimes we're in the same building as them. You build that relationship of trust. It's a bit like building a relationship of trust with your missus. You know, I have my responsibilities. I sort the car tyre pressures out, and I, you know, just know it's my responsibility. I do it, and I do it when I'm supposed to do it, and if I don't, then I get told off. You know, and Kerry has her responsibilities, and that's how it works, isn't it? You know, you work together and you build the trust because you know what's part of your responsibilities. It's not written in a contract, but that's the way it works. So do that more. Fight very hard, work very, very hard to get very close to whoever you're dealing with on the other side of the fence, because it will pay dividends. The NEC supports that in terms of communications. It encourages communications. It says, you know, once one party does one thing, the other party does something. It gives a timescale for doing that. If there's no timescale prescribed, such as you've got 3 weeks to produce a quotation, then you've got to respond within the period for reply, which is written into the contract and agreed at the beginning. Very often you see 2 weeks. So again, it's encouraging things to flow backwards and forwards of information. So work to that, understand that. You know, a lot of people won't know what the period for reply is on their particular contract. So go back to work tomorrow and find that out and make sure you're dealing in that manner. The NEC helps with separate communications. It says to be effective, you've got to write separately. So you can't hide 3 or 4 compensation events into the minutes of a set of meeting, which you very often try and do, don't you, as a contractor, hidden in the bottom. Or you write a nice letter saying we're closing down for Christmas, wish you all the very best, Mr. Employer, and bang, by the way, we're going to be putting a claim in for X, Y, and Z, so that on the 3rd page, hopefully, hoping that the employer won't read the letter. So you can't do that. You've got to make sure, use pro formas, make sure things are separated from other issues, and hopefully you won't fall foul of that provision. And what I do like about the NEC is it stimulates good management. This little phrase, awakens responsibility. So it says things like, contractor, 3 weeks to quote. Project manager then has 2 weeks to assess. So he's got to do something. He's got that responsibility. A lot of project managers are fearful of a £1 million CE put on the desk. Bloody hell, I've got 2 weeks now to review this and I'm frightened to do it. Happens. So if he doesn't do it, then the contractor notifies the PM and says, you've had your 2 weeks now, Mr. Fred Bloggs, you need to do it. If he still doesn't do it within a 2 week period, then it's deemed accepted. So that's what I'm talking about, awakening responsibility. You're forced to do things. Can't let things just slip and slide away from you.
Well, was that never the issue in previous contract?
Pardon?
Like you say, it's a time frame, isn't it?
Yeah, but the deemed principle process under most contracts, you know, it's not. This is a concept whereby you've got, if you notify the other party.
No, but FIDIC is always, it's a stipulation.
Yeah, FIDIC says things like, if you're aware of an extension of time, then you give 14 days notice and what have you. Yeah, so it's different procedures, but it doesn't go to the same level as saying, you know, write to the other party. That's the difference. Write to the other party and tell them they haven't done something, and then let them fall foul.
It's being more specific.
Yeah. It's forcing the system a little bit more, which is good. So the project manager needs to give reasons for his non-acceptance. Again, that's good, isn't it? You can't just deny something. You've got to say why. And the reasons have to be in accordance with the reasons you've given. So for example, you can't just reject a subcontractor because you've worked with a subcontractor on a past job as a project manager. You didn't particularly like them on the last job. So there's a reason for not accepting a subcontractor is because it won't support the contractor providing the works. So just saying, I'm not accepting that insulation subcontractor because I don't particularly like them. Not a good experience. That's not acceptable. So that wouldn't be a reason for non-acceptance, and that would then become one of the CEs on the previous slide.
What I'm going to do is I'm not going to go into all the detail under the change processes because, like Dominic said, if you want to know the clauses off by heart, you want to be geeky like me and know all the 19 reasons,
Thank you. Yeah.
just read the contract. You know, it's written in a language people can understand. It's not that difficult, and if you ever do find difficulty with a particular clause, the guidance notes are really good. So when you're working on a job, the easiest way to pick up the knowledge of the clauses is to just read the contract. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the key processes, why they're there, who's got to do what and what you can do to get it right. So I'm not going to labour how many weeks you've got to reply or anything like that. I'm just going to touch on all the key points. Broadly, change management under NEC is three things: programme, early warnings and compensation events. Now I think if you ask most people, early warnings and compensation events would be the first two processes everyone knows for managing change. But the first biggest one is programme. It's always overlooked. Is there any planners in the room? Okay, so you do all the moving the bars. Any QSs? You don't worry about all those bars. But not under NEC. So, for example, if you're a QS working with NEC or a commercial project controller, you can't afford not to know the programme, because that drives everything under change management. So we'll have a little look at the key points on programme and then how that interlinks with early warnings and compensation events. So it's been said that the programme's the beating heart of the ECC. So obviously everything in this contract is about good project management, and good project management is about controlling time. So as we all know, the biggest thing in getting your cost right and delivering to your forecast is delivering to your programme. And too often programmes are set up, they're unrealistic, they're forced on the supply chain, and the commercial people don't know enough about them to correctly manage change. Properly administering the programme is in both parties' interests. So again, you very frequently see, especially with a contractor-subcontractor relationship, there's not enough attention given to the programme. Now, the process is detailed in Clause 3. I will touch on it in a minute, but I'm not going to go into great detail again. But very, very prescriptive requirements for programme, which emphasises the importance of it. If you don't comply with the programme clauses, when it comes to things like administering compensation events and assessing the amount due for extension to time, you're going to find it very, very difficult. So if you don't administer the programme, you'll find that a lot of the other clauses become inoperable. So traditionally, programmes can be sort of pushed on the supply chain, and that might come right down from the employer saying, this job needs to finish at the end of 2016. The contractor will say to his subcontractors, this is the programme I need you to work with. And all that then does is create problems. What you should be working with is realistic programmes that come right from the bottom. The people who are going to do the work, saying when they can deliver the work, what a realistic planned completion date is, and feeding that into a main contract programme. What you then get is you find that there's an element of mistrust with programmes, so people don't believe the information on them is accurate. When it comes to assessing compensation events, you have arguments about whether they were realistically going to be able to deliver the work. So people get really worked up about programme under NEC and about accepting programmes, when really it's a basic process where you give a detailed programme, you sit with the other party and you do your best to try and agree a programme, and then you've got a working document that you can use to run the contract. As I said there, nobody benefits from inaccuracy or gamesmanship. So I'm not going to go into great detail today. It's a very complicated subject in itself about assessing changes to the completion date. But a lot of contractors or employers think that there's ways you can maybe play games, or you can manipulate your time risk allowance, or you can play about with your float. But I can tell you, for every example of where you think you can come up with a way to generate yourself a bit of a benefit, I can tell you the flip side of it where it doesn't work. So there should be a clear, accurate representation of how you're going to deliver the job. A whistle-stop tour of the programme requirements then. So the first programme is either identified in Part 2 of the contract data or submitted within the period stated in the contract data. So ideally, you want it in your contract data Part 2, so that when that contract's signed, you've got an accepted programme, your first programme to go up from day one. If not, you submit it in the period stated, which could be 2 to 4 weeks after the contract date. A programme's got to include all of the things in the list in Clause 31.2. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire list. As I've said, if you look at the programme, you look at the contract, you can have a look through the list yourself. But you can see from a glance, that's Clause 31.2. So a lot of those things, the first few, the starting date, the access date, seem very straightforward. But what you've got to do is make sure that you understand what that terminology means under NEC. So what's the importance of putting the access date on the programme? If it's not, what's the starting date? What's the difference? So you need to understand what it needs to show, and you need to check and make sure that your programmes show absolutely everything required. Or one of the last bullets on that list, for example, is a statement of the resources that the contractor plans to use. Very, very rarely see that included. So for every activity, a statement of what you're going to use to do the work and who's going to do it. And the shame is, the reason that is there is so that when it comes to agreeing compensation events, there's no dispute over how many men are going to be doing the job, what plant you're going to be using, so it's very straightforward to physically agree what resources you're pricing, whereas if you don't include that, then you don't do it. In terms of the planners in the room, has anybody, do you think your programs have you worked with NEC, have you experienced during these requirements? Well, something quite unique to NEC is in terms of the program. If you don't submit a first program which shows the information that the contract requires, you can withhold 25% of the price work done to date. Now that's huge. That's saying this is how important this document is. If you haven't got one, we're holding a quarter of your money back. The project manager's got to reply, so we touched on before, he's got to reply and he's got to state from the 4 reasons why he doesn't accept the program if he doesn't accept it. It can be subjective because what's realistic is often argued, and that's a very common problem you have of the argument of what's practicable and what's realistic. There's no deemed acceptance of the program clause. That's something a lot of people were hoping would be in the 2011, 2013 updates of NEC, but they weren't. So if you don't reply to the program, yes, technically it's a breach of contract, but actually quantifying and capturing the recourse is actually very difficult. Early warnings, now again very unique to NEC, but all early warnings are, if you're used to working in a project control environment, it's just good practice. It's just flagging something up. It's just saying there's something that's going to happen. It could cost more, it could delay completion, or it could impair the performance of the work. So good practice and nothing to get too excited about. So I'll touch in a minute about how early warnings are perceived. But either party can and both parties should use the early warning tool. So it's not just something for contractors to use as a notification method. It's something the project manager should be using as well to say to his contractor, I think there might be a change coming your way. So it's a tool that both parties should use to manage change, and it is all about risk management. It's not about liability. I've noted there clause 61.5 and clause 63.5, whereby if you don't raise early warnings, the project manager does have the benefit of hindsight. So that allow 61.5 and 63.5 allow the project manager, when he's assessing your quotation, to say, you didn't raise an early warning, and if you had, I think this might be £20,000 cheaper because I might have contributed to it being cheaper. So it's not a condition precedent to entitlement, so it's not something that you've got to notify to get your entitlement to a compensation event. But if you don't raise an early warning, you give the project manager the ability to retrospectively manage the risk because you haven't done it at the time. So making sure that you raise those early warnings is key, because obviously you could find when it comes to assessing the compensation event, you don't get the entitlement that you would otherwise have been due. In practice, you can often get comments from project manager or employers saying, you're raising too many early warnings, you're being too adversarial, I don't like all these notifications required under NEC. Really, what you should be saying if you're the employer is, I'm going to score my contractors based on how many early warnings I get, useful early warnings, because it gives you the best chance of working together as a team to mitigate issues. So the ideal process with an early warning should be that either party will raise one, then the project manager or the contractor can request attend a risk reduction meeting. So what they say is you're ganging up on the problem rather than each other. So rather than getting embroiled in contractual notifications for claims, let's get round the table and come up with the best way of sorting out the problem. So compensation events, again, we looked through the reasons earlier, so these are just events that are employers' risks in the contract. Now, the intent of the mechanism is to put the contractor in the position he'd have been in had the change not occurred, so that he suffers no financial penalty. In practice, because of the proactive nature of the compensation event mechanism, you ordinarily are pricing your change before it's occurred. So each compensation event is like a little mini tender. So whilst the mechanism is designed to put the contractor in the position he would have been in had it not occurred, you've got to be very careful, because just like a tender, you take an element of risk. Now, whilst you can price risk in your compensation event, you've got to make sure you follow the procedures properly, because if you don't price it properly, you leave yourself exposed to price and risk in the exact same way you would with a tender. It's designed to be a quick process, so it's designed to be something that happens quickly and at the time, and it means that you don't get to the end of the job with a big raft of claims. In theory, whilst it can be quite timely if you extend the periods, what you should try and always do is aim to better the periods. I've often heard people saying, well, I'm going to wait until the 8th week before I notify this change, because I'll get more certainty by then, and I'll use all 3 weeks with my quote. You know, what you should be aiming to do is, they're an absolute maximum that you must comply with. Aim to better them. You know, the same with the programme requirements. You've got 2 weeks to agree and accept the programme. So we've been through the 19 reasons, just a couple of points there that if you do use options B or D, or the secondary options, you can add to those 19 reasons. Those 19 reasons apply to all core clauses, and there's additional ones. In terms of assessing compensation events, it's generally a 4-stage process that goes through notification of the event, the quotation, the assessment of the quotation, and then the implementation by the project manager. So each one of those stages is quite clearly defined in the contract. So we'll just have a quick whistle-stop tour and go through the key stages of notification, quotation, and assessment. So as we've said, the C's that arise from the project manager or supervisor giving an instruction, the project manager should notify the contractor at that time. Now in practice, he doesn't always do that, and it's up to the contractor to notify him to say that this is a compensation event. If the PM should have notified it to the contractor, then the 8-week time bar doesn't apply. It's a lot of people seem to understand the 8-week time bar, but that confusion of it not applying when the project manager should have notified it is often exists. The project manager then has a week to make his decision and to say, yes, I agree it's a compensation event, or no, this isn't a compensation event. If he doesn't, the contractor can notify him, and he has a further week to say yes or no. Now, the important point to make on this notification stage is that a compensation event notification takes 15-20 minutes to draft. Give the detail of what the event is. The works information is changed. Here's drawing Rev A, here's drawing Rev B. You don't spend any time putting together a big quotation. You don't spend any time looking at your programme. You're just flagging up that this is a notification of a compensation event. Assuming the project manager instructs a quotation, the contractor then has 3 weeks to prepare his quote. So he has to go away and he has to look at the impact of defined cost and the impact of programme. The project manager then has 2 weeks to reply. If he doesn't reply within 2 weeks, the contractor can issue a notification reminder to say you haven't replied, and then has a further 2 weeks. If he still doesn't reply, then it's deemed accepted. Now, a lot of people probably fell asleep at 3 replies ago, which tells you that deemed acceptance is very rare under NEC, because what it tends to do is it tends to G the other party up. It might G them up into just saying no straight away because they don't like your reminder, but again, it's intended to keep the issue current and make sure that you're not leaving things to fester. Assessing compensation events. Now, one of the subtleties about NEC, as we've said, is everything is supposed to be proactive in a forecast. So you define cost, you divide in line for actual defined cost and forecast defined cost is either the date that the project manager gave the instruction, or should have done, or the date that the contractor notifies the compensation event. So what that means in practice is most of the time you will have done very little work by the time you're coming to prepare your compensation event quotation. So especially in the nuclear world, you have clients asking for 5 files of invoices. You've claimed for a piece of timber and you quote for 15 quid, I want the invoice. And in reality, that's not how NEC works, because that divide in line means that more often than not, you're putting together a forecast. You change to the completion date, so you are also required by the contract to show changes to your programme. When you're looking at changes of completion date, NEC, and again, it's something that I could talk about at length as a separate subject about plan completion and your completion date. The two are different. The completion date is a defined term, it's capital C, capital D, and that is your liability date. That's your contractual liability date to which damages apply, or to which unliquidated damages if you've not used delay damages. Your plan completion date, which is a small p and a big C, is the date which you think you're going to have done everything in the works information. So that's when you're going to have achieved completion. Yeah, that's exactly it, yeah, and that can be at any time. Yeah, so you might have your completion date might be 1st of June, your plan completion could be the 1st of January, 30th of December. That's just whenever you think you're going to finish the work. Now, when you're assessing compensation events, it's that plan completion you're looking at on your last accepted programme. So it's very important to have current accepted programmes so that when you're looking at compensation events, you're looking at the right baseline. And then all you're doing is looking at the movement in plan completion. So if your completion date was the 1st of June, but your plan completion was the 1st of January, if your plan completion then goes out 3 weeks from the 1st of January, you get 3 weeks on your 1st of June date. So your liability, your completion date is always tracking your plan completion. So it's something that, again, if you're a planner or if you're a commercial guy, you need to work together to understand that. You need to understand the critical path on your project, understand what's driving plan completion, and when you have a compensation event, you need to marry the two together, and you need to demonstrate the changes.
If the change doesn't affect the end date, but does affect some activity within the programme,
Yeah.
pushing some of those out, is that a basis for compensation or not?
It is, yeah. You've got to show any changes to accept the programme. So even if they're not critical path, if you're just using float on other activities, then you do have to revise your programme still, and you have to quantify the effect of that. Now what might happen is, in reality, and again, it's something when you just consider in basic terms your plan completion and your completion date, and you think, oh, that moves. That's when contractors especially their mind starts ticking and thinking, well, what if I'm already in delay, so I don't get absolved of all my delay from an employer delay? Well, no, you don't, and neither should you. But the other side of it is, if you've got 6 months float on an activity and a compensation event's instructed that erodes 6 months float, that changes your risk profile.
Yeah.
So that is the way it works. You have to keep updating the programme every time. Your defined cost is built up generally in accordance with the schedule of cost components, the full schedule if you're under option C. Time risk allowance is something that the contractor owns. So generally you've got 3 types of float under NEC. You've got total float, time risk allowance, and terminal float. Total float is available for anybody. So the contractor might be slow with the progress of works. The employer might use up total float with the compensation event. Time risk allowance, again, is something that with NEC, it's not defined in the contract. The only way it's defined is once you understand the mechanisms and you've applied them to a programme, you can see what the definitions are, because you can see what moves plan completion or not. So there's no, this is what float is, but by virtue of the fact you're looking at plan completion, you can erode total float because that doesn't affect plan completion. So it isn't that clear, but with time risk allowance, that's something that people get quite excited about. And all that is just saying to the contractor, with critical activities, can you just show me that you've made a reasonable allowance? So if you're excavating in December and you think it's going to take 10 days, well, how many days risk have you got in that? I just want to know it's realistic. And you say, well, of that 10 days, I've got 3 days risk allowance in there. So all time risk allowance need be is a column to just show on critical activities we've assessed our risk properly. So again, just touching before what I said about design management and stuff, the most common change is 60.1, change to the works information. And the most common frustration we see is you look at the compensation event notification and it says, change to the works information, need 2 more pumps, cheers. You know, that doesn't convince anybody that the works information has changed. It's not saying you don't need 2 more pumps, or the pipework layout hasn't changed, but your job as a project controller is to know what's changed and why it's changed. And if you want to succeed with managing the comp event process, yes, you need to know what you've got to do. You need to comply with your time periods, you need to get your notices in, but you need to know how you've got to do it. You need to put yourself in the other person's shoes and realise that just sticking notifications in isn't enough to get entitlement to a compensation event. You know, there's no magic answers. You still need to manage the contract. You still need to convince the other party why they should part with their money for a change to the contract. So in summary, as we've said, the NECs are set procedures. You need to know them. You need to understand them so that when you're using them, you make sure you're using them properly. And you need to work together with the other party. So it's no use sitting in site cabins that are 10 metres apart, but realistically feel like they're 2 oceans apart and email each other. You need to communicate properly. You need to make sure you embody the spirit of the contract and make sure that you use this proactive early risk management systems to your benefit. And again, it's often said that NEC is heavy administratively. The NEC have actually banned people from putting that in their marketing literature, that it's administratively heavy, because obviously companies, these are online admin systems picking up on saying it's administratively heavy. And what they say is, and I believe it's true, is that if you put the effort in at the start, so you spend your money when you should, you avoid getting to the end of the job with a load of uncertainty and spending a load of money on claims. So you put the effort in now, and then you reap the rewards through the course of the job. That's about everything.
Okay. Anybody, any questions?